The Supreme Court again declines an emergency request from gun rights plaintiffs. Plus, Discourse Magazine editor David Masci on the troubling connection between chaos and gun sales. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free weekly newsletter now. If you haven't already, you will get one email a week straight to your inbox that tells you exactly what's going on with guns in America to keep you up to date. And of course, if you want to go a bit deeper, you can buy a membership and read our analysis pieces. There's hundreds of them that are member exclusives, and you get a number of other memberships perks as well, like the ability to appear on this podcast as we have today. We have a member segment at the end of this show, so make sure you stay tuned for that. Always a joy to do those. But before we get to that, we are going to have, I think, a really interesting discussion with the editor-in-chief of Discourse Magazine, David Masci, who is here with us now. Welcome to the show, David.
Thanks, Steve. Nice to be with you.
Yes. Can you tell us a little bit, before we get started, a little bit more about Discourse and a little bit more about your background?
Yeah. So Discourse is about 3 years old. It was founded in October of 2020. It's published by the Mercatus Center, which is out of George Mason University. It's an online magazine. It's entirely free. There are no subscription costs or anything like that. And it's a general interest magazine. It's a journal of politics, economics, and culture. And it has a couple of different missions. The sort of primary mission is to promote and defend liberal values, small L liberal values like tolerance, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, free markets. And this is all part of the Mercatus Center's mission as well. And sort of within that, Discourse tries to be a venue for different perspectives, different voices on all kinds of issues, including guns, and offer readers different perspectives, because we think that when ideas sort of meet, when perspectives meet, at the end of the day, our readership, our society in general, is stronger. So that's where Discourse, that's Discourse's mission. And again, it's entirely free and online. So I hope some of your listeners and podcast watchers will check it out.
Yeah.
Oh, and we have great, I was going to say, we have great authors, including Stephen Gutowski. So,
yes, I've written for Discourse on a number of occasions, and I plan to write for it again. In the future, if we have some good ideas that come up that we both agree on, I'd be happy to contribute some more over there. I like what you guys are doing.
Right.
And you're on Substack now too. So it's a pretty easy thing for people to subscribe to if they want.
It is. Yeah. So if you subscribe, there's no pitch for donations or anything like that. We'll just send you each article, as it's published, and then a newsletter at the beginning of every week with a specific article written by one of our editors, myself or one of my colleagues, and also some lists of articles from our archives. So I think it's a win-win for people. So I hope they look at it. I hope they subscribe. So,
and that editor's article is one of those is what we're going to be talking about today.
Right.
Specifically, a piece that you wrote called "Gun Ownership is a Hedge Against Chaos." And I think there's some really interesting ideas in here.
Mm-hmm.
There's some stuff that I've thought about for a while now. We've described on this show a number of times how gun sales tend to increase around events where people feel that they're insecure, right?
Yeah.
That they feel that things are a bit out of control. They want to have that ability to protect themselves if need be. And this is why, for instance, in 2020, you saw such a huge increase in gun ownership. We've talked a lot about this over the last couple of years on this show. Gun sales have become a kind of chaos meter, perhaps, or at least the Americans' perception of chaos to some degree. Not all gun sales, obviously, are driven by that, but the big spikes that you've seen over the last several decades really have surrounded this. And it's kind of, as you note in this article, the thesis of this article is that it's connected to this change in gun culture that went from more prioritization of hunting to one that more prioritizes self-defense. Not that those things, of course, are. It's more like a priority change rather than people weren't ever concerned about self-defense before, or that people don't care about hunting today. But can you just walk us through like what it is about this that concerns you? Because that was the main thing, is that this is actually there's concerning aspects to this.
Yeah. So, I think that people are feeling more vulnerable than they did maybe 20 years ago. I think they're less trustful of institutions, including the government and police, the institutions that have been, tasked with protecting them. I think it's hard to underestimate, and I don't think we really even fully know yet, the extent to which COVID contributed, amplified some of these feelings. Certainly everybody felt vulnerable in March of 2020, and when we didn't really have a clear sense of what was going on. And then there's the sort of disorder that followed the George Floyd protests and the various cities, the sort of destruction of property, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, January 6th and the assault on the Capitol. I think all of these things helped to create a greater sense of vulnerability, a greater sense of disorder and chaos, as you said, you used the word chaos meter. So I agree. I think we're at a time when people are particularly concerned about these things. As I say in the piece, I get that. I really understand it. And not only that, but I have at times thought about buying a gun too. And I'm not a gun owner. I never have been. So I don't know if you want me to I can talk a little bit about that, but
yeah, certainly. Well, first I want to just get into that 2020
sure
motivations just a little bit, because it's there like you said, there was March 2020, the shutdown started to happen. People, the virus was spreading. Police were short-staffed. There were prisoner releases, and there's a lot of good reasons why people might feel insecure at that moment. About how, there were food shortages, basically everything you could imagine in a worst case scenario situation.
Yes.
And so it's not surprising that drove a lot of people to want to have the option to defend themselves. Then you had the George Floyd's killing itself, which made a lot of African Americans feel insecure and increased tensions between minority communities and the police. So that leaves a lot of minorities feeling less than secure themselves, more distrustful of law enforcement, which can drive people to buy guns. Then you had the protests and eventually the riots that followed that, which made lots of other people feel that the police couldn't protect them either. That drives people to buy guns. And then, January 6th, political violence at the Capitol, something that hasn't been common in the United States since the Civil War, right?
Yes.
That drives that's another motivator for people to go out and buy guns. And, I think the gun owning perspective on this, or at the very least the gun rights movement's perspective on this, is it's good that people have that option, right? That if they feel like police or the government can't protect them, that they have an option to go out and protect themselves. And so it's looked at, I think, primarily as a positive thing when gun sales go up, and more, especially when it's among new gun owners, people who hadn't owned guns before. And so that's what I want to dig into a little bit more, because obviously you can see the logic there among gun owners. Like, it's good that people have the option to defend themselves. But I want to get a little bit more into why it can also be concerning.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I definitely think people should have the option. I say that in the piece. And obviously I believe in some safeguards to make sure that guns don't fall into the hands legally, into the hands of the wrong people. But I definitely agree that law-abiding citizens have the right to arm themselves. I definitely understand why people feel vulnerable, why they might want to get a gun. And gun. And as I mentioned, I've never owned a gun in my life, but I've thought about getting one in the last couple
Right.
of years for the very reasons we're discussing. But I also see a negative here. And the negative is that in a society where more and more people are owning firearms, particularly for the purpose of self-defense and not recreational shooting, which used to be the primary reason why people bought guns, for hunting, for skeet shooting, for target shooting, and things like that. And today, of course, it's flipped, and it's now largely driven by a desire to protect oneself and one's family and friends. All of that, I'm fine with that. It's just that I do think that it's a bad symptom, or a symptom, I should say, of some very bad things that are going on. So, and we can tick through some of those. I mean, let's start with maybe the biggest overarching problem, which I think is a trust problem. And if you go and look at polls over the course of the last 30 or 40 years, you'll see that at virtually every major institution in America, including law enforcement, including the government, including private institutions that are public facing, like the media, whatever, they've all lost dramatically lost trust. In many cases, almost, 60, 70, 80% of Americans will say they don't trust particular institutions. And so when you have that, you definitely have people asking themselves what they can do, what sort of workaround they can affect when an institution, at least in their mind, isn't doing its job properly. So there's that. We talked about crime. Obviously, there's been a spike in certain kinds of crimes. I know there has, some crimes have not gone up, certain property crimes, but the biggie, right, which is homicides, that's risen. And it's risen just in the last three or 4 years. It's stayed relatively high.
Well, it's declining now, but
okay.
it is still higher than the pre-2020 levels.
Right.
And yes, there was a jump that went almost back to the 1990s levels, which were much more, people haven't realized that the last 20 years have been relatively low.
Well, and
murder rate in the United States.
If you look at the murder rate, you'll see that it's gone since the 90s. It's gone down, 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 and then it's sort of up. It's ticked up again. It's not where it was in the 70s, which was, I think, at least in recent history, the highest it was in our country. But in 2020, 2021, it got pretty close. And I think, again, some of this isn't necessarily entirely about reality. It's about perception, right? I mean, perception is ultimately true or not true or partly true, is what drives people to do things. And in this case, is driving people to buy guns and train how to use them. So there's crime, there's trust, there's a sense of, I think polarization, political polarization and social polarization certainly helps. Again, I mentioned COVID and its impact. So you used the word perfect storm a few minutes ago. I think we came pretty close to that. And I think, as I say in the piece, while I understand why someone might say, oh, I think I need something here to protect myself because I'm much more concerned about my safety than I used to be. On the other hand, a society in which, say, I don't know, another 25 or 30 or 40 million people now have firearms, I'm not so sure that's a better society. And I mean, I just worry that, again, gun accidents, people getting upset and shooting each other. I assume, and again, I can't imagine that I'm wrong about this, that it's just much more likely when people are armed than when they're not. And it's sad that people feel the need, and it's not a criticism of them, but it's sad when people feel the need to do this. Most of us who don't really probably are probably not all that interested in guns, not interested in hunting or these other things, probably wouldn't own a handgun, but for this fear. And so who wants to go through life afraid? No one. Who wants to feel this necessity? I'm sure the people who are buying these guns would much prefer not to feel it. So I see it as obviously I support the right to purchase firearms for self-defense, hunting, any reason like that. But I also feel like it's too bad that we've reached a state in our country where this is happening.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think a lot of gun rights advocates would disagree with the last bit about more people owning guns being a negative. Obviously, that they would, most gun rights advocates feel the other way, that it's a positive. But I do think that, this perspective of, looking at, as somebody who supports gun rights generally, like you do, also recognizing that the reason why a lot more people are buying guns now is not necessarily a positive one, right? Like that's a much more interesting conversation to me, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think a lot of gun owners, a lot of gun rights advocates would argue that people should own guns, that maybe, people are kind of, and maybe you can, especially coming from a libertarian think tank, from a libertarian standpoint, that people are too trusting of law enforcement or the government to offer them protection, in even just normal times.
Yes.
Right. That this is a common argument you hear in gun rights circles, that like, my 45 is faster than 911. Right. Or whatever.
Right.
Or when seconds matter, the police are minutes away. These are common tropes or arguments that you hear. There's obviously truth to them, but it gets at this idea that people that there's a belief that people are too trusting of government in this way. It's for their own personal safety, as it is. Yeah. And so when these issues arise, this sort of chaos happens, and people start to reconsider that calculation and they buy a gun. I think people view that, as in the gun owning community, as a positive thing. But you're saying that, I think this is something I've thought as well, that, if a lot more people are buying guns because they're really worried about the state of the country, that they may need some sort of deadly force protection in the near future, that's not necessarily a positive societal sign.
That's right.
That's what you're getting at here.
Yeah. So let me sort of bracket my response with a couple of things. One is I grew up around guns, so I'm not unfamiliar with them. My dad was a big hunter, a big skeet shooter. Guns were a big part of his recreational life. And I joined him in all of that when I was a teenager, when I was a young man. We did a lot of that sort of thing together. I never really enjoyed it all that much. I did it largely because I wanted to spend time with him. But I came to respect his use of guns, the safety, his commitment to safety, his commitment to being very careful. I got to know a lot of his friends in that world, and I liked them personally, and I found them, again, very responsible in their use of guns. So I have a positive view of at least that gun community, and I have no doubt that people who are buying guns for, as I think I said in the piece, people who are buying guns for self-defense, I'm sure they're almost all law-abiding, decent people. And again, I am someone who thought at one point that I would. I've thought at times that I would join them. But the reason we know that a lot of people bought guns during that period is not because there's a national registry that can tell us how many guns are out there. It's because we follow the background check numbers. So people presumably who are buying them can pass a background check to get them, which indicates that what we're seeing with that increase was, law-abiding people buying guns. And as David Masci points out in another discourse piece, we see an uptick in the number of people who are training to use guns. And so, that's a good thing too. Obviously, you don't want someone just buying a gun, loading it and walking around. So all of that is good. So it's not my criticism is not of gun owners. It's just it's not a criticism it's a criticism more of our country and the direction in which we're headed. Yeah. When you look at this,
you see it more as a signal. This is not,
that's right.
Even though you might, you support gun ownership, generally and gun rights, this current cycle that we see with gun sales being driven by specific kinds of concern,
by fear,
is what worries you.
Yeah. I mean, let's just call it what it is. I assume a lot of people are afraid, justifiably. maybe the fear sort of paces reality, but a lot of these perceptions are at least partly based on reality, if not wholly.
Yeah.
So, but when you see, I mean, what prompted me to write this piece was the recent NBC poll that showed that for the first time, at least since they'd been asking this question, which I think they had been for about 25 years, a majority of American households had either a gun or, someone owned a gun in a majority.
American voters.
Among American voters, yes. But actually, and I know that some people might say, well, that's not everyone, but that's actually it tracks pretty well with the adult population. I used to work for a polling outfit. And so it's a very good way to, it's not an inaccurate way to look at sort of the general public opinion and general sort of public views. So you have a majority of people, let's assume, by the way, that poll is an outlier and that it's really 48%, not 52% or 46%. I saw a poll from Gallup from a year or two ago that said 45%.
Yeah,
let's assume
CAP had it at 46.
Okay, so let's assume it's there. We don't even have to go to 52. That's incredible, actually. And a lot of women are buying guns. A lot of African Americans and other minorities are buying guns. Obviously, people are feeling afraid. And as I said, when Pew, and I think it was in 2023, polled people and asked them why they were buying guns, recreational shooting was at about a little over 30%. Almost 3/4 said that they were buying guns for primarily for self-protection.
Yep.
And again, I just urge people to think a little bit about that. That really is an indictment of how our society has been developing, how elites have been running our society, and the lack of trust that average people now have in that. And again, that sort of tracks with what we know about trust in elites and trust in elite institutions just in general. Again, you can take the media, you can take professions like law or medicine. Very few institutions in America. Congress is at the very bottom of the list.
Yep.
But very few institutions in America rate above 50% in terms of trust. I think the military does. I want to say small business owners maybe, but it's just a tiny number. Institutions you would assume would, including law enforcement, they're quite far down. Churches and religious institutions quite far down. So we're living in a much lower trust society. And I think that the gun sales are reflective of that. And again, I'm just pointing out that that's a shame. And I don't think America will be, I'll disagree with the gun lobby or gun control, not gun control, gun advocates on this point. I don't think it's great that, let's say we reach a point where a majority of adults own a handgun. I don't think that'll be a good situation. I just don't. I do think there'll be more violence. And again, I'm not one of these people who thinks that, for example, if we banned all guns tomorrow, crime would be dramatically reduced, or that there would be no more school shootings or things like that. Unfortunately, I don't think that would work. But I do think that a highly armed population is going to be a country with a highly armed population is going to be a more dangerous place to live. So because we're all human, we all make mistakes. When you have a gun, your mistakes can be just much more dramatic and much more tragic.
Well, I certainly think that there's base level agreement about keeping firearms, as you mentioned earlier in the show, out of the hands of people who have shown themselves to be dangerous and gone through,
yes,
court process, gone through due process, like, convicted violent criminals, people of that nature, people who have been adjudicated as a threat to themselves or others because they're mentally ill, that sort of, there's very broad base, I think, support for those. There's obviously, I think, much more debate over whether or not everyone else having a gun is good or bad. And you get, I don't want to turn the whole show into just this back and forth, but there's arguments on either side. Obviously the gun rights side, you hear often that murder decrease we talked about earlier occurred while gun sales were increasing significantly throughout the country. So, and there are other points on the other side of that as well. But But it sounds to me like you do have some basic concern about more people owning guns generally, because you think it could lead to confrontations that wouldn't have ended in with deadly force implications. Now will is sort of what you're getting at, I guess.
Yeah.
With that point, but it seems like your bigger concern is why people are buying guns.
Yes,
because which is an indicator of. Another indicator, I suppose, alongside all these other things that you mentioned,
yes,
of just growing societal issues in the United States with trust in one's neighbor, trust in one's government, one's law enforcement, one's whatever institution you point to,
yes,
and that people trust those less now, and that's leading them to buy the means to protect themselves. And so, if people were buying guns because hunting became a renewed, just gained
yes,
renewed popularity, that wouldn't be as much of a concern for you. Or if, 3-gun shooting became the next big professional sport and everybody wanted to start 3-gun shooting, and that's why they were getting into guns, that wouldn't be as much of a concern. But it's this specific role that chaos and fear of, oftentimes legitimate fear of what's happening in society, that's where your concern comes.
Yeah, I think if we had, in the 1990s, we had a great sort of push, which of course famously began in New York, to find ways to deal with crime and to lower the crime rate, and it succeeded. I was actually covering Congress as a reporter when the crime bill was being debated, and actually Joe Biden was one of the people who pushed the crime bill through the Senate. And the idea there was, we have a better idea of what works. Let's double down on that. More police, better ways to deploy them, things like that. I think and again, there are so many issues here. So there's a huge mosaic of issues. We can talk about trust in the police. We can talk about what the police have done to either earn that distrust or not. There are lots and lots of different things we can talk about, but it would certainly, I think, be better for everyone if people felt safer, and that feeling was based on reality. And again, I don't think it's quite as bad as a lot of people think. Again, that's why I said earlier about perception. Some of this, I think, is perception. I have felt it too. I just give you an example. I used to take the metro to go into work, and after there was some kind of mass shooting, for a week or so afterward, I was actually, I'm sitting in a tin can underground. If somebody pulls a gun out and starts shooting everybody, it's pretty hard to get away from that. And so, that sort of thing goes through your mind when you spent, 2 hours watching CNN talking about something like that. And then you get on a train, where there are absolutely it's not like an airplane where at least there's a security, system in place to try to prevent those sorts of things. So, again, I'm absolutely, I completely sympathize with these feelings and empathize with them because I share them. But when you take a step back, I don't think it's a good thing. I don't think it's a good sign.
You think it's a bad trend? Right?
Yes.
That's really the trend that concerns you, not so much the concept of buying a gun because you're concerned about the outside world, but this trend that's becoming a much more common reason for people to buy guns.
And again, let's assume we get, the polarization subsides, the crime rate drops, trust levels start rising, and somebody comes to me and tells me they still want to buy a gun because they feel like they need to protect themselves. Yeah. I don't want to take that right away from them. But because I may want to exercise it one day. Although, as I say in this piece, I'm a terrible shot. I'm not sure how good I'd be at that. But
that
also,
can be fixed with practice.
I would say one other quick thing, and that is I knew someone when I was growing up who had used a gun to defend himself successfully against someone who was assaulting him. There are these more public examples, like what happened in Oregon and was it Clackamas, I think, where someone shot someone who was about to engage or beginning to engage in what probably would have been a mass shooting.
Yeah, so there have been a number of those.
And I thank God those people were there. So, it's a tough issue. And I don't think there's some sort of one answer to all of these questions. And as I said before, there are lots of different things going on. I mean, we could talk about loneliness and the loneliness epidemic in America.
Sure.
There are lots of issues that I think are adjacent to this or touch on this. It's not just about crime or disorder or COVID or whatever.
Right.
I think there's a lot going on here.
I mean, I think that, just to get into, I guess, my personal, I don't do this a lot, but just my personal views on it. I do definitely see that concern with the trend, right? That the fact that more people are buying guns because that more and more people feel insecure in society, or what's happening with society at large. That's definitely concerning, along with all the other factors that you noted. Certainly, you could obviously also make the argument of like, how secure should you feel, even if things were going great? Things are much better now than they were in March 2020, right?
Yeah.
But what is the proper level of concern for your own personal safety? That's a more, I guess, more personal discussion to have.
Right.
Like,
it's
how
subjective.
much should you trust the government? How much should you trust law enforcement? I think law enforcement, usually the vast majority of law enforcement officers want to protect people and would try to protect you in a situation where you're facing a deadly force, but they don't have any legal requirement to do so. Nobody has that, only, to defend you. And so at the end of the day, how much security should you feel? Like, that's the other thing, is like, I don't know, but that's separate, I think, a little bit from the trend question. If more people on a societal level are feeling less secure, and that's why they're buying guns, maybe you think it's good that maybe you think they've made the right calculation because you thought they should have been buying guns anyway before, but you can still be concerned about that trend, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think if, this is a very subjective choice. It's very, as you say, a personal choice. And so a lot of it is just how people feel. It depends on their circumstances. If you're taking a walk, if you're working a night shift and taking a walk at midnight every night to your car after you get out of work, as opposed to me who stops working at 6:00, it's just different for everybody. Small business owners obviously often have firearms. And again, I know there are people who study this sort of thing, and I don't know exactly how that all shakes out, whether you're safer with a gun if you're in a store, if you're a store owner or not. But I understand.
It also comes down to like personal philosophy of whether you'd like to, not whether a gun makes you invulnerable, right?
Yes.
But whether you'd like to have the option, even if whatever negative externalities exist for owning guns.
Yes.
Right. And that becomes a personal philosophy, a personal question to a certain level. But yeah, I mean, I still think, even at the end of that, even if you're somebody who thinks, well, any reasonable person should own a gun because of X, Y, Z, and you're encouraged by more people doing that, you should still be concerned about if the reason they're doing that is because everybody thinks society is getting worse.
Yes. Yeah. And even if you think, and I don't necessarily share this view, but even if you think the more the merrier, the more gun owners we have, the better.
Yeah.
As you say, you should still be concerned because of the reasons. No one, I assume, even the most sort of the strongest gun advocate wants to live in a society where gunplay is common.
Right.
And so
shootouts are not something anybody should want to see.
Right. And so, we built a civilization in part because we wanted to create an environment in which people could thrive, and that included security and order. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we've given the monopoly on violence to the government and asked them basically in exchange to protect us. So,
to some degree, right?
Or we've asked them. So,
yes. And monopoly may be the wrong. I know that's the term everybody uses, but obviously you still have the right to self-defense. I get what you're saying, though, for sure. But for people who want to read more of your writing and this piece, obviously you go over the Discourse Magazine, but what else is over there? How can people follow you and the magazine?
So you can go to discoursemagazine.com and the magazine will pop up. We have a presence on all social media, so you can find us there as well. You can find us through the Mercatus Center and the Mercatus Center website. And the Mercatus Center, by the way, does a lot more than discourse. It's just one tiny piece of their work. They do a lot of great economic work. They have a pluralism, and sort of speaking to this subject, a pluralism and civil exchange program that they've been building. So it's a great place with all kinds of wonderful initiatives. Discourse, again, is just a piece of that. And then, I write probably every other week or so for Discourse. Other than that, I'm editing great writers like you. And we have a lot of really wonderful people, including Steve, who write for us, folks like Martin Gurry, and others who have written for us in the past, like Matt Ridley. Again, we publish on virtually everything. So you can read about, in what the piece we put up today was by Tevi Troy on Jewish funerals. I mean, so, it's very eclectic. It's not just all public policy oriented.
It's very interesting.
Mercatus is known for its free market economics. I mean, that's sort of part of its core mission. And we have some wonderful people here who write for us, Véronique de Rugy and others. But
there's a lot more to it than that.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great. We appreciate you coming on. And we're going to head over to our news update now.
All right. Thanks for having me, Steve. It was a pleasure.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. How are we doing this week, Steve?
I'm doing well, Jake. Better than all right, which is what we always normally say.
That's right.
How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm a little tired. Like we were talking off camera, I had an office Christmas party for my full-time job last night, so I'm dragging a little bit this morning. But here I am for the podcast for all you listeners out there.
Dedication. That's good. I appreciate
That's what we bring here at the Reload.
Yes, we'll have to do a Reload Christmas party at some point. Just the two of us over Zoom.
That's right.
From Virginia and Colorado. I wonder if I've stopped getting invited to the free weekend party. Oh, I'm being snubbed, I think. I'm going to have to complain. No, I'm actually going to the Christmas trees in DC tonight. There's, for anyone who doesn't know, they're like the Congress and the White House have like competing Christmas trees for some reason. I think the White House one gets more attention because the president does like a ceremony every year, and they have like a concert and stuff, and so it's kind of a big deal. But the Congress also has a giant tree that they bring in and put up, and I think they call that one the People's Tree. So I don't know if this is meant to be a rivalry thing or not, but if you've ever been to DC, the White House and Congress are not very far away from each other, so it's pretty easy to go and see both of them. It's a bit of a walk if it's at night and it's very cold, like it's going to be tonight. So I'm going to probably drive from one to the other, but they're very nice. They're giant trees. They're all lit up. They got, usually some sort of theme, or they have school children send in ornaments and stuff. And the White House one has a tree for every state as well, a normal sized tree out front that you can walk around and look at. But it should be a fun time going with my girlfriend and some friends and their kids. So looking forward to that. Also I dropped off finally my concealed carry permit application for DC. Now, anyone following along the podcast knows that this has probably been like a 6-month, I guess, adventure. I'm a little bit longer than that, I suppose, because I got the training done in April, and then the next available application drop-off appointment day, because that's they make it. All I did was drop off my application this week, and I get into this a lot more detail on the Active Self-Protection podcast. So if you want to hear about the whole experience, you should check that out. They call it the Gutowski files over there. So check that out for a longer version of the story. But that you had to schedule the appointment. That was like 3 months out from when I did the class. And then I had to cancel that one. I had to cancel twice for various reasons. I get into it, including when that murderer was outside my mom's farm and I had to go up there. That was also happened to be the day that I was supposed to drop off my application. Anyway, finally done, which, you might think, well, that means you have your permit. No, I got to wait another 60 to 90 days to actually get the permit. And I don't believe they even send you a physical permit anymore. They just send you like an email with a digital copy of it. So I guess if you ever get stopped by a cop, you have to like pull out your phone and show them. I don't know.
Make sure your phone's charged. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I'll probably print out a copy of it as well. I think a lot of people do that, but
yeah, it's
always interesting how different jurisdictions handle that. Like Virginia, it's just a little flimsy piece of paper that's like signed with ink. And you're supposed to carry that around on you all the time. And they last for 5 years. So, they get pretty ratty after a while.
Yeah,
if you
I can imagine.
Don't store them right. In Pennsylvania, they give you a nice laminated copy, which I appreciate, with your picture on it. Virginia doesn't require a picture. DC does. I don't know. It varies state to state, right? For unclear reasons why it's different. But anyway, hopefully I'll actually have my permit by June. Maybe.
Be almost a year-long process by the time it's all said and done.
Yeah, I mean, I got delayed, so it's my experience is a little bit longer. But you can hear the whole thing on Active Self-Protection's news podcast that I do with them. But not a great experience, as you might imagine.
Sure.
But yeah, what about you? How outside the Christmas party, what else you got going on?
So the the shooting that I told listeners about last week got postponed to this weekend. Just we had some scheduling problems so we're going to go tomorrow to that fancy range that I was telling everyone about called the Gallery out here in Colorado. And what's funny is after we shoot, they're actually hosting a watch party for the Division II College National Championship. It's Colorado School of Mines. So it's a big engineering school out here, is in the national championship. And a buddy that I go shooting with is an alum from there. So we're going to go shoot and then go watch the Division II National Championship in the little bar restaurant area. So I'm looking forward to that.
Engineers playing football.
It's crazy, right? Yeah, it is. It's like the least you would not expect them to be a Division II football powerhouse, but they've been killing it the last couple of years.
Hey, that's awesome. Engineering was big at my school, Messiah University. It was Messiah College when I went there, but I guess it's upgraded since. They were big Division III, because they're a very small school, soccer powerhouse, and men's and women's. They would win the national championship at basically almost every year in both. So, I don't know. I guess engineers some of them are pretty good at sports.
I was gonna say, some of them are sneaky athletic.
Yeah. Anyway, what do we got in terms of news this week?
Yeah, so in terms of links in the newsletter, one interesting one comes to us from the Santa Fe New Mexican. It's sort of a validation of an analysis piece you wrote about the Go Safe Act, the Gas-Operated Semi-Automatic Firearm Exclusion Act, which was the 4 Democratic senators' attempt to rebrand an assault weapon ban. Hadn't really gone anywhere at the federal level, but we now have the New Mexico governor saying that she plans to introduce a version of that act in New Mexico. So it's getting some legs somewhere.
Yeah, well, that was one of the weird things about that bill at the federal level, is that they made this big, PR announcement about it, this media push for it, and then Chuck Schumer had a vote on an assault weapons ban, and you thought, well, maybe it's going to be this one because it probably has a better chance of getting to 50 votes than the traditional assault weapons ban. And then no, he just put up the regular assault weapons ban, and of course it didn't go to an actual vote, so it didn't really matter in terms of potential embarrassment for not getting to 50 votes. But this is supposed to be a rebrand effort, which you'd expect would be used to try and get a little more support. And New Mexico hasn't been able to pass a normal, traditional style AR-15 and large capacity magazine, so-called large capacity magazine ban yet. So they're going to try this effort. And obviously New Mexico is where Heinrich is senator from. So I guess they're following his lead in this way. And it'll be interesting to see how that turns out, especially because of how poorly the bill is written, the actual text of it. It does a lot more than I think these senators understand that it does. Like we've talked about the implications of some of the text in there. Anything that can improve the rate of fire of a semi-automatic handgun, or any semi-automatic, actually, not even just gas operated ones. We talked about how in this bill, gas operated is defined to mean things that aren't gas operated, systems that aren't gas operated, like blowback or recoil operated. They're just put into the definition. They just call them gas operated anyway. It's a pretty weird bill, honestly. But anything that makes a semi-automatic function quicker, the rate of fire faster, would be banned under this bill as illegal to possess. So that could be the obvious intention of that is bump stocks or devices like bump stocks that help you fire a semi-automatic faster than you otherwise normally could. But it says anything with that produces an appreciable difference in rate of fire. And that could be a lighter recoil spring, a lighter trigger. They don't get into the details of it, but it sure seems like it could apply to all those things as well. So in a number of ways, it's much stricter than a traditional assault weapons ban. In some ways it's less strict, right? But we'll see how it fares down there in New Mexico if they actually get through with it. I also think it's a rebranding effort where the brand is much worse, right? Because most people don't know what a gas operated semi-automatic firearm is. They have no idea what that means. And it's not as scary sounding, I would think, either as assault weapon, where people have a general vague idea of what that means.
Right.
So I don't know. We'll see. We'll see if it has done enough to change the dynamics in New Mexico.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, their legislative session kicks off this January, so we'll get to see relatively soon whether that can improve the fortunes of that type of bill. Yeah. The next link we want to talk about today is a funny story funny just for the political implications, but the New York Times has a report that the ACLU has stepped in to represent the NRA in its upcoming Supreme Court First Amendment case. So a little bit of strange bedfellows going on at the Supreme Court.
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, the ACLU was supportive of the NRA's position in this case from the beginning, right? And it's important to remember here, this is a First Amendment case.
Yeah. It's
not a Second Amendment case, even though it involves the National Rifle Association. It's about when a New York regulator, the financial regulator in New York, essentially sent a letter and told financial institutions, insurance companies, banks, that they should consider not working with the NRA, essentially, over reputational risks because of the NRA's political opinions. And hopefully anyone who's listening to that description can understand why this created a First Amendment issue, because you have a government official pressuring essentially private companies into boycotting a group based on their political beliefs. That's sort of the baseline here. Now, the NRA hasn't fared well at the lower courts. They lost at the appellate level because the judges in that case, and I'm paraphrasing here. This is a very quick summary, but we wrote about it in the past, so you can look it up. But the exact wording of this ruling. But essentially, their claim was that the official was using her power to persuade rather than trying to forcefully intimidate these financial institutions into complying with what she wanted. And so essentially they're just argued that she hadn't done enough to cross the line into violating the First Amendment. Now, this is a case where I think often we do a lot of tea leaf reading about the Supreme Court here, and we're going to do some in a moment as well, some more. But this is one of those cases where I think the court taking the case in the first place gives you a pretty good indication of where they're going to end up on it, because the lower court, oftentimes you can theorize that the Supreme Court is only taking cases. I shouldn't say only, but many times when they take a case, it's because they want to overturn what the lower court had done. Unless there's, a circuit split or something like that, you might be a little more complicated, or there's some novel thing about a new standard that they've set up and they want to clarify themselves further or what have you. But this one, you're talking about First Amendment litigation is pretty well established at this point, and or jurisprudence. And so it's hard for me to look at them taking this case and not immediately think they're going to overturn the lower court and rule in favor of the NRA. The ACLU getting on board is interesting in a political sense, because it's certainly good for the NRA. It's a win for them. They're probably going to win this case, and that's going to be, a real positive mark for them. And after a series of negative ones for the last couple of years, right? They've shrunk a lot. They've lost 1 million members. They're still undergoing, this corruption case in New York, but they will probably get a win out of this one, and it'll be at least good PR for them. They might win a couple, some money out of it too, from New York State over the violation of their rights. But what interests me more about it is the ACLU on their end. They actually had some pushback for doing this from some of their chapters. Yeah. I think North Carolina was the first one to make a big deal, I think. But I think it was like 3 or 4 chapters.
And most prominently, New York State's chapter, which is where this case is taking place.
Right. So internally, they had arguments against doing this, essentially claiming that the ACLU didn't need to get this involved in the case and defend the NRA, because the NRA has lawyers of its own and has money, and they could afford good lawyers or whatever. That was sort of the argument you saw. But it also did just kind of come to, there were a number of arguments about how the NRA is like bad, so they shouldn't represent them. Sort of bottom line was what some of these groups were posting, right? Which gives you an indication about where the ACLU is. We've talked about this in the show in the past, right? This sort of degradation of these single issue groups, whether it's the NRA or the ACLU, where they've kind of become more like identity groups. They're more like the ACLU has stopped advocating for civil liberties in all cases and been more willing to court just issues that appeal to liberal Democrats, because that's the core of their base of supporters, right? And the same thing with the NRA to some degree. Not completely in either of these groups, but to some degree, you've seen them branch out into other areas that don't have anything to do with their mission. You've seen the NRA talk about immigration or vaccine mandates or things like that. They've made ads to that end. And because they become sort of, in some ways, a conservative Republican identity group, because that's the core of their membership. And I guess the calculation for a lot of these groups is not just the NRA or ACLU. You see this across the board with a lot of single issue groups, where the issue has been totally captured by one party or the other. And so you get a lot. You see this with the gun control groups too, right? A lot of their ads there's a lot of what people call intersectionality, right? That you get a lot of gun group ads talk about abortion instead of guns. And so in that sense, seeing the ACLU take up a case to defend the NRA is a departure from that trend. And depending on whether you like that trend, it's either good news or bad news. I would say it's good news. That's just a personal opinion, because I think this trend is bad. But regardless of how you feel about the trend, it is interesting to see the ACLU go out and actually take on the case instead of just filing an amicus brief or something like that, which they had done at the lower court level. And we'll have to see where this all ends up, though.
I'll say we'll certainly keep following that as it
And
moves forward to the Supreme
The NRA
Court.
is probably going to win. The ACLU and NRA are probably going to win, just to be
Right.
just to make a bold prediction there.
But speaking of legal developments with kind of humorous political implications, we have a story that we covered this week about the Hunter Biden indictment and the step that his legal team took to fulfill a threat that they initially made during the early stages in the investigation. They've officially filed a motion claiming that his gun charge indictments are unconstitutional under the Second Amendment, citing several of including the Fifth Circuit case we've covered, where the appeals court in that instance and several other district courts have ruled that the federal prohibition on drug users from owning guns or purchasing guns is unconstitutional. And they're saying, well, that renders Hunter Biden's indictment unconstitutional too. So that's certainly interesting. We have the president's son taking an opposite position to the stance of his own father. So,
yeah, I would say more remarkable than there's some humor in it, I suppose, but it's just because there's an irony to that setup of like the president is very in favor of enacting new gun restrictions, and enforcing very strictly the ones that exist.
He even increased the penalties for this very charge that Hunter's facing.
Right. So there's certainly an irony there that Hunter is now going to be on the other side of that fight, and that, but it's just more like remarkable to see this happen, where you could have. There's a realistic chance that you could get a U.S. v. Biden Supreme Court case over the Second Amendment that sets a Second Amendment precedent, or at least as part of a collection of cases like the Fifth Circuit one that you mentioned, Daniels.
Yeah.
Because Hunter, there's oftentimes you get these sort of legal theories that get filed in cases that are high profile, that are kind of done to grab headlines, right? And they're not actually going to go anywhere. This isn't really that. Hunter said he would do this, or his lawyers said he would do this, and now he has. And it's not a like far-fetched idea that he could win on that, because other cases, as you noted, there's defendants winning on this argument. And so, it's not a crazy idea, especially because the burden under Bruin, the Supreme Court precedent, which we'll also talk about in a moment here, puts the burden is on the government to prove that the law is constitutional rather than the other way around. So it's a relatively low effort, I guess, argument by defendants in these cases, because the burden it hasn't always been, to be fair. If you look at how some of these lower courts have come out, a lot of them just kind of like, the dicta in Heller says, longstanding prohibitions on felons are okay, so we're going to extend that and we're not going to do all the work, and the government doesn't have to present all the evidence that its law is part of the historical tradition or whatever. But this is why you're seeing people with public defenders make it up to the Supreme Court on these kinds of charges, even very unsympathetic plaintiffs like Rahimi, who is the current case at the court right now, subject to a domestic violence misdemeanor and had a gun and was accused of a bunch of crimes outside of this particular case. But, he made it all the way up because that's the kind of legal argument that Bruin unlocks, and that's what Hunter is now making. And we'll have to actually legitimately follow along with how this goes, because it's not going to be necessarily something that gets tossed out immediately as a sort of frivolous claim. Yeah. And that's what makes it all really remarkable. You had a whole analysis piece on this a couple weeks back when the possibility was raised, and now we have it unfolding in real life.
I was gonna say it will be interesting to watch. Like you said, it's certainly not far-fetched, especially these days because of the post-Bruin world. But it's not a slam dunk either, right? We've seen plenty of district courts that have upheld the prohibition, so there's no guarantees one way or another. But it's certainly just because of who the defendant is in this case and the stakes, it makes this one, I think, one of the more closely watched versions.
Yeah, and we're going into President Biden's reelection campaign where he's down in the polls at the moment. So it's another political distraction for him. as well. So
Certainly.
there's a lot of legitimate news hooks to this thing. There's a lot of attention on Hunter Biden just generally because he's President Biden's son, but there's reasons to cover him, even if you don't usually pay attention to the kids of politicians or whatever. This case has a lot of legitimate hooks to it from a news perspective, I think.
Certainly. And then the final story we're going to cover today is another one that we wrote up this week, also dealing with the Supreme Court. Another instance of the court refusing or denying a request, rather, to intervene early in the ongoing saga with Illinois' assault weapon ban, or in this case, a municipal assault weapon ban in Naperville. So it's the second time in this exact case from the National Association of Gun Rights, who's the gun rights group plaintiff that's bringing this case. They've tried now 2 times to get the Supreme Court to step in, and both times the court has unceremoniously denied that request.
Yes, unceremoniously, basically silently. There's been no noted dissents. The court hasn't written anything about why it's not getting involved at this stage. The important thing to keep in mind is that these are emergency requests. People call this the shadow docket sometimes, because sometimes the court will get involved on an emergency basis and won't explain itself. This is sort of a way of short-circuiting the normal legal process to try and get the court to do something before it's, your actual turn to ask them for help, right? If that makes sense. That these cases haven't gone through the merits completely yet. They're at the preliminary injunction stage, which is where, this stuff I know gets really confusing for normal people. And it can be confusing for us too, right? As people who aren't lawyers. But the preliminary injunction stage is essentially where you're trying to get a law blocked before it goes into effect, and you're trying to do that quickly. So you're asking for basically unusual. It's hard to call it unusual because this is how a lot of cases go, but you're asking for early relief before the merits of the case have actually been argued technically, even though to issue a preliminary injunction, judges have to find that it's likely the law you're trying to get blocked is unconstitutional. And so there's very few circumstances that I'm aware of where, in the cases that I've watched at the very least as a reporter, where the preliminary injunction ruling doesn't match the merits ruling, even though technically they don't have to, if that makes sense. So you're sort of the way these courts are set up. There's good reasons for these things. Potentially, that maybe we should have a lawyer on at some point to just go through some of this basic stuff. But the only point here is that you're not at the merits level of the case. You're not at the full argument stage with this assault weapons ban case. You're at the stage where the group is trying to get a block put on the law before you go to the full merits discussion. And it seems that the court just doesn't want to get involved at that spot in any of these gun cases, right? The Second Amendment cases, at least. Now, the complication here. So first, from that, I would say you can't draw too many conclusions off of what's going on with this stuff. Has the court changed its mind about the Second Amendment or the Bruin test or any of this stuff? I don't know that you can make a solid conclusion just based off of what they're doing with these emergency requests. At the same time, they have granted to the government in the ghost gun ban case out of Texas. The ATF, the rule that they put in place to administratively ban homemade guns without serial numbers, or the sale of unfinished gun parts, essentially. That rule has been found likely unconstitutional, and there have been preliminary injunctions put on it. And the court has stepped in when the government has requested an emergency stay on those rulings to keep their administrative rule in place and enforcement in place while the case goes forward. And they've done that twice. There were some noted dissents on that. It was, I think there were 4 conservatives who dissented in that instance. I think it was Roberts and Barrett who didn't, right? If I'm remembering it right. But again, like even that, while I'm sure it's like understandable that gun rights advocates would be upset with the court for issuing those emergency stays, but not issuing emergency injunctions in like the New York gun free zones cases, or the assault weapons ban case out of Naperville, Illinois. I don't think that any of this tells you how the court is going to go on the merits on any of these cases. Is like the ATF one, that's not a Second Amendment case, first of all, or hasn't been adjudicated that way. At least there are some Second Amendment claims in there, but it's more of an administrative powers case. And I don't think that the court, if you look at their record to this point, they've been very skeptical of administrative power. If you look at like the EPA case from last year, it was a pretty big blow to administrative power. And so I would be surprised if any of these have more than a procedural justification for why they're doing this. They seem to want, in the Second Amendment cases, I think they want full records to be developed before they take something. They just handed down Bruin, last year. And so they're getting a lot of requests to follow that. And I think they want the lower courts to go through the entire process and build a full docket before they actually do anything on it. And keep in mind, they are doing a Second Amendment case. Rahimi that I mentioned earlier, they're literally doing a Second Amendment case right now. They may not want to take a bunch of Second Amendment cases until they get through that one, and probably through the other ones that are directly implicated by that one, like Range and Daniels. So the other thing to it, right, is really they've said a little bit, right? In the New York case, you had Alito and Thomas issue a concurrence, meaning that they agreed with not getting involved at the stage that they were asked. But they issued a concurrence where they called the ruling against New York's law thorough. They basically praised it and told the Second Circuit that they need to hurry, or at least not delay things. But like judicial timelines are very stretched out. Like I understand why people get upset about this, because they view like, well, these assault weapons bans are going to go into effect while we're waiting for the courts to get through this process. And we all think that this stuff's unconstitutional. So the court should just step in and say it is immediately. And sometimes the court will do that with things, but most of the time it doesn't, on a whole variety of things. And it doesn't mean they're not going to, but that's just where I'm standing. And I think the main thing, they said that in that case, but what's stronger evidence to me that this isn't how they're handling this is an indication of where the court is at on the Second Amendment today, or that they've changed how they view the rights in the case, is the silence. You don't see dissents from the conservative justices, especially like Thomas and Gorsuch, who had previously been open to issuing dissents when the court rejected certain cases. And you don't see them talking about the Second Amendment being a second-class right in dissents. That if you start seeing that stuff happen, that's when you would think that maybe something has shifted on the court. Or, just wait until they issue Rahimi and see what they say there. That'll give us real insight into what they actually think, because it'll be their actual written opinion.
Right. No, I think it's a good point. And just to kind of put a final point on it, that Alito and Thomas concurrence, you're right. On the one hand, they praise the lower court ruling while saying they're not going to get involved. But Alito specifically wrote, like, I understand us not getting involved to mean we respect the Second Circuit's procedures. Yes. So they literally spelled out like, hey, this is about is respecting lower court, due process and procedure. So the fact that they said that in that one case, I think it's fair to say that probably similar logic applies to some of these other cases.
I think you're right.
To your point, you can't really draw too much conclusions on how they view the merits of these cases.
Yeah. But again, I understand why
Sure.
the gun rights advocates don't like it, why
Sure.
they would want the court to start doing more. But, keep in mind between Heller and it was like 15 years between Heller and Bruin. And they took like one important gun case in that time in Satano. And so the court is actually moving really fast in comparison. Now they have a Second Amendment case. They're likely going to resolve two more that the DOJ has, the Daniels and Range cases that DOJ has asked them to intervene on. And then it's entirely likely that they might do a Second Amendment case every year or more than one from this point forward. I mean, I get it. People want relief when they think that their rights are being violated, understandably. But it's just the court doesn't always work that way. And it's important not to read too much into this one way, regardless of which side you sit on, because you've seen a lot of like Illinois officials who claim that this is now, and I've seen media members trying to claim that this means that the court approves of assault weapons bans. And I don't think that's at all what it means.
Right.
It's not impossible that the court has shifted either. So I don't want to forestall that. I'm just saying, based on what's happened, that's not the conclusion I would draw. But that's all we've got time for this week. If you want to support our reporting, you should head on over to thereload.com and buy a membership today. You'll get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of reporting and analysis that you will not find literally anywhere else. And you will support the work that we do. That is how we get our funds to operate. We are not funded by anyone else but our members. And it is vital to our work that we have those folks supporting us with their membership dues. Of course, you also get a lot of value out of that, I think, in being able to read these analysis pieces that you can't find anywhere, and also getting this podcast a day early and the opportunity to appear on the show like our next guest here. We have a member segment this week. So we're going to head over to that now. All right. I'm here with Reload member Chris. How do you pronounce your last name, Chris, actually?
Michaels. It's just missing the A.
Yes. I always this is something I always had issues with when I first started doing the podcast, is I asked the guest name and how to pronounce it. And then I wouldn't remember right after asking them. It's always an adventure. So Michaels is not that hard, though. That's a pretty good one. But yeah, it doesn't have the A, so I wasn't quite sure.
I get called all sorts of things.
Welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on and doing this member segment for us. We haven't had one in a little while, so I'm excited about it. And yeah, just why don't you give us just a little bit of background about yourself? Where'd you grow up? Do you own firearms? Have you always owned firearms? If not, how did you get into it? That sort of thing.
Well, I grew up till I was about 9 in the Midwest, kind of all over the place. And then my family moved to Phoenix, Arizona, the Valley, and when I was about 9. And I lived there till I went to college. I've been in Arizona ever since.
Okay.
I started shooting when I was pretty young. My parents took me to shooting like 22s and things like that. Mm-hmm. My mom was a better shot than my dad, which was kind of cool. But they both, took me a little bit of like rabbit hunting, things like that. And then when I got into college, I started doing some bird hunting and I went elk hunting for a while. And then in about 2011, I had a incident with a former employee that got me into concealed carry.
Oh, okay.
And which then led into more gun rights activism and interest in that.
Okay. And you're in Arizona now. What do you do for a living? Are you retired? Or are you still working? Or?
Well, I did IT for about 35 years at Northern Arizona University, and I retired 4 or 5 years ago. And so now I'm taking it easy. I do some shooting and try to do a little bit of volunteer work, community service, things like that.
Oh, wonderful. And so you're still, actively into firearms. You still shoot. Do you do? You said you got interested in like gun rights. Have you been active in like advocacy in that area as well? Or?
Well, I live in northern Arizona, and it's tough to get to the valley to do anything at the state capitol. So most of my stuff is remote, writing letters, making phone calls. Life member of NRA, the Second Amendment Foundation, and the state rights group, the Arizona Citizens Defense League.
Okay, so you do have that little bit of activism that you take part in where you live out in Arizona. And so what as far as guns go, what kind of shooting do you like to do? You mentioned hunting earlier and concealed carry, so I'm guessing you have a variety of firearms then.
I have, a dozen pistols, a few rifles, a few shotguns. I don't hunt anymore. I had a stroke a couple of years ago, and it's made it a little more difficult to do various things, balance issues, some vision issues.
Yeah.
But
how have you adapted with after the stroke with shooting?
Oh, it's interesting. I went to a red dot. I was really against red dots before. I was like, no, I don't want to spend the money. I don't want to take the time. But now it takes my vision a lot longer to focus when I change focal distances. So the red dot's really easy, much easier because it's focus on the target the whole time, and I don't have to jump back and forth.
Yeah, certainly.
And then the other thing I had done is I shot long guns right-handed all my life. And I was at a steel challenge match, and all of a sudden my vision just changed and I couldn't hit anything. And so I started shooting rifles left-handed. Okay.
So you had to adjust all that from how you had been doing it, huh?
Yeah, and I was kind of worried about it, but it's worked out pretty well.
Oh, good. And do you still carry? You don't, if you don't mind me asking. You don't
Sure.
have to say.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I got my concealed carry permit in about 2011, 2012. But Arizona's permitless carry, constitutional carry now.
Right. What system do you like to use? What kind of holster?
I used to be strong side, and it's still a little more comfortable, but because of some of my physical limitations, it's faster to go appendix. So I've switched to appendix. Thanks to John Correa and Neil Widener.
Active self-protection guys. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. I tried out the Filster. It took me about a month to get comfortable with it.
Yeah.
But now it's my preferred my preferred method of carry.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, that's appendix. It takes a lot more adjusting to get used to. I find.
It was hard at first.
Yeah.
But like they say on the Filster Concealment Workshop, stick with it. It takes at least a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think it's a really great resource and a good community over there at Filster, and they really help you dial in things if you haven't done it before. In my experience, at least, and I think once you do that, once you get it dialed in, it is something that you realize some of the advantages of it. But there's still trade-offs, regardless. There's always going to be trade-offs when you're trying to carry around a gun on your person, right? And so I think you have to change your wardrobe a little bit to make appendix really work, even with something like a whole Filster that's independent of your clothes.
Fortunately, I didn't have to, and it was actually better going appendix.
Okay.
I printed less.
Yeah.
The biggest problem I've had with the Filster is if you go to a non-permissive environment, it's much more difficult to take the holster off or take the gun out in an inconspicuous way in your car.
Yeah, you kind of have
or
to
next to
partially undressed to do
that just doesn't work very well.
No.
So strong side's much better for that.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? If you have to leave it in your car, which is obviously never ideal, but sometimes can happen. That's fascinating. So, obviously you've been shooting your whole life here. You carry. You used to hunt. You're very active with firearms, and you have that advocacy aspect too. Is that how you got into the Reload? What was it that drew you to the Reload, and why did you decide to become a member?
Well, it was definitely an advocacy thing. Sandy Hook happened on my birthday, And it really set me off because I had a granddaughter that was just a little younger than the kids there. And it really bothered me how people painted the gun rights community as, I'd say responsible. And I heard about it every year from on my birthday until this year. So I got kind of sick of it. But so I started listening to podcasts, looking around, doing some research. And I think I heard you first on Armed American Radio.
Okay.
I think you're back at was it the Free Beacon?
Yeah,
back
the Free
then?
Beacon. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I always liked your, I'll say, fair and balanced view of things. So I started reading the Reload for a while. And eventually I decided I wanted to hear your analysis. And I wanted to support you because I think you're doing a unique thing in the gun rights community. I like hearing from other opinions besides my own. I don't like the echo chamber or extreme on either side. And I felt like I got a good balance of that from the Reload.
Oh,
so It was worth it.
Well, that's wonderful. That's exactly what we strive for here. So I appreciate you saying that. And so, when it comes to looking forward for you with your collection of firearms and carrying, what are some of the things you still want to, do down the line here?
Well, right now I'm like shooting Steel Challenge, USPSA a couple times a month. I'll keep doing that. I'd actually like to try to go maybe trap or just shooting some clay pigeons or something with a shotgun to see how it works left-handed. I might go hunting again for something easy, but I don't feel like doing week-long treks for elk anymore.
Sure.
And I'd say continue teaching my granddaughter how to shoot. I took her to a couple Steel Challenge matches this summer with a 22. She was good. It was great. So trying to, I guess, pass Second Amendment advocacy or interest onto another generation. That's important to me.
Yeah, I think that's important to a lot of gun owners, and I want to try to get more into some of this competitive shooting as well. Hopefully I can get some of the free time to do that. Maybe we expand the Reload a little bit, and I'll have a little more free time when it's at that point. But that's wonderful. Well, look, I appreciate you taking some time out to come on and talk to me about just your life and your experience as a Reload member, and we really appreciate you doing that.
You're welcome, and I really appreciate what you and Jake do.
Thanks. And if you're listening now and you want to get a membership too, if you want to be on a member segment or get access to those analysis pieces that Chris mentioned, you should head over to reload.com right now and check out our member options. We really appreciate it. We literally couldn't operate this place without people like Chris and the rest of our members. So thank you again, Chris. I appreciate you coming on. That's all we've got for this week.